September 2016, nearly 2 months before the then presidential candidate Donald Trump's election, President Barack Obama spoke at the UN General Assembly.
As I address this hall as president for the final time, let me recount the progress that we've made a quarter century after the end of the Cold War. The world is by many measures less violent and more prosperous than ever before.
But with millions of people displaced worldwide, unresolved conflicts from Yemen to Syria, Iraq and Afghanistan, and armed groups like ISIL and Al-Qaeda launching attacks against civilians, was President Obama's speech too optimistic? His top UN diplomat at the time was Ambassador Samantha Power, who was responsible for securing international consensus on a variety of pressing issues at the Security Council and General Assembly. I'm James Bays at the United Nations in New York. How has US foreign policy changed since President Trump took office, and what should have been done differently? And with the next presidential elections in November, will Ambassador Power pursue a new political role in Washington? The former US ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, talks to Al Jazeera. Ambassador Samantha Power, former US ambassador to the UN, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. Let me start from having read your recent memoir and ask you to rewind to November 2016. You were still the US ambassador. It was election night. You had a party for all the female ambassadors of the UN. You invited them to your then residence at the top of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel to celebrate, I think, what you thought was going to be the election of a President Clinton. Can I ask you your thoughts on that night, and now how things stand in the world after 3.5, nearly 4 years of a Trump administration?
Well, James, it was a grim night. We had started off assuming that America would be electing its first female president. That would have profound effects potentially for what seemed possible all around the world, as America leads as a very powerful country no matter what it does, good or bad. And instead, here was the election of someone that had made clear that he had very little appetite for America's alliances, that he had very little faith in multilateral action and in international institutions. Even traditional Republican stalwarts like NATO had come under attack. He had made clear that he didn't really see America in the inclusive way that we had long seen ourselves, making it clear that immigrants were not welcome, making clear that certain minority groups should feel out of place. And of course, he had said that he was going to put in place a ban on travel from Muslim countries. And so there were people in the room that night whose families certainly would have been affected by such a ban. So it was funereal, I would say.
You led, in part, the Obama administration response to Ebola. Can you tell me how you think the response to the pandemic has been, particularly in terms of international leadership and international cooperation?
I think what one sees in President Obama's response to the Ebola epidemic that one doesn't see in the corona response is one major power, in the case of Ebola, the United States, leading. President Obama declaring that he is going to send 3,000 American troops and health workers into the eye of the storm, into West Africa, to try to support local efforts, because we all know that success rises and falls on the work of the brave people on the ground. And so in that support role, he then goes to the other countries of the United Nations, taps people like me and John Kerry and others to go and say, okay, here's what we're doing. We're building 17 Ebola treatment units. What are you prepared to do? We're going to take a leadership role in the country of Liberia. United Kingdom, could you take Sierra Leone? France, how about Guinea? China, how many Ebola treatment units are you going to be building? Cuba, you're famous for your medical corps that works in sub-Saharan Africa. How many doctors and health workers can you send to West Africa? And so the United States wasn't the world's policeman then. It was a kind of catalyzer of global action, and it leveraged what it was doing globally to try to get other countries to pool their resources to solve a collective action problem. Because we all knew that if Ebola wasn't contained, it wasn't just going to wipe out life in West Africa, it was going to spread well beyond that, including to the United States, to Europe, and to major cities everywhere. So the COVID response, though, is different. The United States is not leading within international organizations. The UN Security Council, which I led it for the first time in the UN's history to declare Ebola a threat to international peace and security, hasn't even made that modest proclamation at this stage of a pandemic that has infected more than 3 million people around the world. The WHO, the United States, has pulled back funding at the height of a global pandemic, which is sort of like an Onion cartoon headline, but actually is happening in our lifetimes. And instead of leading within an international institution like the UN, or it's an agency like the World Health Organization, the United States is hunkering down, inviting a kind of hoarding process globally, racing rightly for a vaccine, but making it very clear that anything that we manufacture and produce, is something that we are going to, keep close, and indeed banning U.S. aid from funding NGOs that might be providing protective equipment to people in the developing world, where the pandemic is just now beginning to wallop vulnerable communities. So it's really, really different.
You've seen some of the richest countries on earth really struggling. I'm here in New York City, which has had a very bad time. How worried are you about the more vulnerable countries on earth? I give you an example. Central African Republic, for a population of nearly 5 million people, they apparently have 3 ventilators.
Yeah, they have 3. The country of South Sudan has 4. I think there are fewer than 200 doctors in all of South Sudan. I think, again, one has to think about both dimensions to this pandemic. There is the public health dimension, and the fact that with an absence of ventilators, with an absence of basic treatment facilities, you're probably, in many, many countries, and there is variance in how this pandemic is hitting communities. And so, again, the science on this is a bit murky at the present. But in many, many countries that don't have the health infrastructure to withstand what is coming at them, you're going to see massive loss of life, a much higher concentration of loss of life than in developed countries like ours that are struggling so much as it is. But well beyond the health dimension, there's the economic dimension. These are countries that don't have $2 trillion stimulus packages that are going to be brought forth, where when markets shut down, when social lockdowns occur, when communities actually do their best to observe guidelines that are needed from a public health perspective, that wipes out the economic possibilities of people who are living often hand to mouth. And so the knock-on effects in terms of malnutrition and outright starvation, the World Food Program is now warning that 265 million people are at risk of severe malnutrition, and in some cases, what the head of the WFP has referred to as a famine of biblical proportions. So again, it's the health and the economic together with no cushion and very little ability to be resilient, because so many of these communities are living on the edge.
You've talked about the Trump administration's decision to cut funding to the World Health Organization because they say that it's too close to China. Can I raise that point with you? Does President Trump have a bit of a point there? China is growing more powerful in the international system and managing to silence parts of the UN system, particularly on issues of human rights.
The best recipe for China to increase its influence in international organizations is for the United States to pull back, and that is what the U.S. has been doing since January 20th, 2017, at noon. The U.S. has been pulling out of international agreements, pulling away from its democratic allies, indeed insulting its democratic allies. At the same time, it praises dictatorships and dictators, even like Kim Jong-un and certainly President Xi. And in that vacuum, where the U.S. walks away, the number 2 donor to the United Nations, China, which had overtaken Japan just a couple of years ago as the number 2 donor to the UN, is definitely going to take advantage of that opportunity to try to throw its weight around in more significant ways. And you see that in the Chinese government's effort to get its personnel into more places. to try to offset what is perceived to be an American advantage of decades of U.S. leadership within these organizations and decades of putting U.S. personnel in places of influence. You see it during the pandemic, absolutely, where the World Health Organization senior officials could have been more outspoken, particularly about the stonewalling, I think, that the Chinese government was doing for those critical weeks in January and February. There was the bad information that was provided, there was the insufficient amounts of information that was provided, but then there was the WHO's attempt to gain access to China, where Beijing clearly didn't want external scrutiny to what was happening in Wuhan because they were in the midst of a cover-up. And so at that time, again, with U.S. leadership, it is the job of the United States, other democratic countries, other countries that believe in transparency and accountable governance, to make it impossible for the World Health Organization to sustain any reticence on an issue of this global import. And that didn't happen. The United States wasn't even present. Its seat on the executive board of the WHO was vacant. It was $200 million in arrears, having not paid its dues to the WHO even before Trump's more recent funding cutoff. And the other democracies of the UN haven't yet adjusted to self-organize, absent that kind of catalytic role that the U.S. has played for a while. That may be changing now, as we see with the Solidarity Fund and the effort to raise money for developing countries.
How should the U.S. deal with a more assertive China? Because it is, of course, complicated. China is an important part of the global economic system. And do you have worries that this issue is just going to get more toxic? Now we've got all the discussion about the pandemic and the possibility that China now could become a big issue in the US election.
I am worried. I'm worried about China's actions, for starters, because, again, we have now the global ramifications of authoritarian capitalism, a model that people were praising until quite recently, and yet you see in a culture of fear and a climate of fear how afraid local officials were in China to step forward. You saw China, as it was attempting to sort of hide the numbers and downplay the epidemic, expelling Western journalists from China. So we also don't have independent voices able to move around China to really alert the outside world, even to what is happening right now behind Chinese borders. So I worry about that. I think for a long time, U.S. officials have been quite reticent on issues like the detention of the Uyghurs, for example, or on the real risks associated with the export of artificial intelligence and surveillance technologies, of course, that are becoming more pronounced as part of what is perceived to be the remedy for this epidemic. So we can worry about what's happening in China and what China is seeking to export. I think that's a genuine worry.
Let me take you now to the Middle East and back to your time when you were the US ambassador to the UN. In a previous interview for this program, you told me, when I wake up in the morning, I think of Syria. When I go to bed at night, I think of Syria. And it was very interesting reading your book and the passages on Syria, particularly on that red line on chemical weapons, President Obama's red line that was crossed and he didn't take action. What was interesting to me is that he initially decided to take military action and even set a date for it, August 25th, 2013.
I appreciate you noticing that, James, because there is a little news in that book, I think, given the way some of these histories have been written. Absolutely. President Obama asked me to go to Ban Ki-moon and request that he remove the weapons inspectors who were on the ground looking into the ghastly chemical weapons attack of August 2013 that had killed 1,400 people, including more than 400 children. And I went to Ban Ki-moon knowing that once those inspectors left Syria, that President Obama would be following through on his pledge to hold the Syrian government accountable for such a gross violation of international law. And Ban Ki-moon said no. He said, no, I want the inspectors to do their work. Many in the UN system would have applauded that decision because many were very unenthusiastic about the use of U.S. military force, even though now many of those same people are very critical of how President Obama handled the crisis. But President Obama was good to go. The targets had been chosen, and it was really just a question of not wanting to see the Assad regime holding UN inspectors as human shields and compounding an already devastating humanitarian situation. I should note that the military action that was contemplated was very limited. It was about deterring the use of future chemical weapons. It was not about creating a safe zone or civilian protection areas or carving out large swaths of Syria, again, where civilians might be able to take shelter. So it was limited, but I think when one looks back, one wonders, would just a limited use of force been able potentially to at least deter the future use of chemical weapons, thereby taking out of Assad's arsenal a weapon that he had used for strategic advantage on the battlefield.
What do you think would have been the outcome if he had staged military action? Because remember, this was a year before Russia got involved, and Russia's involvement was what turned the tide. When Russia got involved, the opposition had been doing well and making gains. Could things have turned out very differently? Was this the turning point in the war?
I think it was the turning point insofar as from that point forward, President Assad felt quite confident that there would be no U.S. military involvement in Syria. I will say, as one who was in the Situation Room from 2013 to January 20th, 2017, it never felt like a closed case to me. It always felt like something that was being litigated, that we were thinking creatively, is there some way that this issue can be reopened? But in retrospect, because President Obama decided to use that time before the inspectors came out to go to Congress, the U.S. Congress, and to seek congressional support. So from that point on, I think both President Assad and the key architects of his vicious campaign felt much more confident. And I think you see that as they gradually escalate their bombing campaigns, including in places like Aleppo, where there's just no regard for civilian life whatsoever.
You describe what it was like in the Situation Room. You've described President Obama's views, but there's one figure who also seemed to be opposed in your descriptions in your book to the use of force, and that was the Vice President, Joe Biden. When talking about Libya, you write, Biden had grown dubious about using US military force. He regretted having supported the invasion of Iraq and consistently advocated for winding down the war in Afghanistan. You talk of his skepticism of new military engagement. Does this tell us anything about the Joe Biden who's trying to become Commander-in-Chief?
I think so, but I think it tells us something that is a broadly shared view, certainly across the United States, but I also think across the broader Middle East, which is that military force is never going to resolve the root causes of a conflict. It just isn't going to happen. And yes, it's true that Vice President Biden was deeply affected, I think, by the fact that his son Beau served in Iraq, that feeling of vulnerability for someone you love so much. So many American families have gone through that with people on their 7th, 8th tours in Afghanistan, or those who served 4 tours in Iraq, thought they were done because the U.S. had withdrawn, and then with ISIS ended up back in a training role. And so, it really is the case that local actors, hopefully with appropriate U.S. training and not blank checks, but training in international humanitarian law, pressure and engagement on issues of governance, which themselves have fueled extremism in so many parts of the Middle East, but that there's a tool in the toolbox, and that the U.S. over-reliance on military force has really skewed American foreign policy, and it hasn't delivered the kinds of results I think that the American people, but also the broader global public need. And so I think the Vice President's view is we've got to invest much more in diplomacy. President Trump has ravaged our diplomatic corps. We have to do much better on the economic side, bringing in the private sector, pushing on the corruption front. I think the way that Vice President Biden has embraced Elizabeth Warren's anti-corruption agenda should resonate in the Middle East in ways large and small. But the United States is also a lot more effective on issues like that when it's acting with its partners and when we're acting multilaterally.
You write a lot in your book about Syria and about Libya. You barely mention Yemen, yet that was a conflict started by Saudi Arabia and the UAE on your watch, and the Obama administration didn't speak out against it, yet it's now become the worst humanitarian disaster on earth. Do you have regrets?
I certainly have regrets about our Yemen policy, absolutely. And I think that it was one thing in the first instance when the Yemeni ambassador to the United Nations, and you remember this day, came to the UN and said, my country has been overrun. I've had to escape my capital city in hiding to avoid Lord knows what. Help. When a sovereign head of state comes, and this is not a sovereign head of state who had forfeited his claim to international legitimacy like someone like Assad or Gaddafi, but when that Houthi militia takeover of Sana'a and takeover of large parts of Yemen happened, I think it was very reasonable to come to the aid of the sovereign government. And indeed, you mentioned that the United States didn't criticize the Saudi coalition. It went much further than that. The United States actually supported what Saudi Arabia was doing militarily by providing intelligence and military support of all kinds. I think the problem was that very soon into the Saudi-led campaign, it became clear that Saudi Arabia was very interested in our money, our intelligence, and our weapon systems, but not very interested in our advice or our legal counsel, for example, on which targets could be struck and which targets could not be struck. And I think at that point, that was really the time to turn off the spigot and to say, you know, there are too many violations of international humanitarian law happening. If you want to learn, just like we had to learn in Afghanistan and Iraq, about how to discipline this fight. I mean, you're losing hearts and minds every day on the ground in Yemen. It's in your interest to learn. Then we are here to provide that counsel. And we sent lawyers, you know, to engage the Saudi government at all times, but there was so little receptivity to our counsel in that conflict. And I think absolutely we should have pulled the plug on assistance to the Saudi-led effort. And I don't know that that would have changed Mohammed bin Salman's calculus. I don't know that that would have caused him to reassess his own agenda. But here we are all these years later. No progress has been made from the Saudi standpoint militarily, if anything, the opposite. And all that this war has meant for the people of Yemen is heartache, disease, starvation, and bombardment. And so no one can look back at this and not have regrets, frankly.
The mastermind of that Saudi-led war in Yemen was the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He's been accused of human rights abuses. He's been accused of murdering the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Do you think it's time for the US to recalibrate its relationship with Saudi Arabia?
I think it has long been time. I mean, in many ways, I think public and even political understanding of the US-Saudi relationship is forged in a different era, at a different time of U.S. great vulnerability in terms of energy dependence on Saudi Arabia, on fears about Saudi Arabia as it related to Israel and the Saudi agenda there, fears that Saudi Arabia also would allow the inculcation of terrorism or abet it in some fashion. And I think if you look at Saudi Arabia's interests as it perceives its interests now, many of the issues that the United States has been pushing for a long time and believes it needs its leverage to secure cooperation on are issues that Saudi Arabia seems to believe it is in its own interest to pursue. I think the Saudi-Israeli relationship is different and changing. Saudi Arabia's own relationship to terrorism, but also its broader support, for example, for people like al-Sisi, who lumps together members of the Muslim Brotherhood and ISIS and treats them as one. You see Saudi Arabia pursuing policies on its own, and you see it, as in the case of Yemen, very reluctant to take U.S. counsel as it relates to the conduct of its war in Yemen, the conduct, of course, as it relates to something like journalists, whether a journalist like Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Turkey or journalists inside Saudi Arabia. And again, from the standpoint of U.S. interests, U.S. national interests, we don't need to be falling over ourselves to accommodate policies with which we disagree. We need to have a complex, multifaceted relationship that includes accountability for things we disagree with, partnership when partnership is appropriate in terms of our interests, but not a kind of old school autopilot, which is what often I feel we bring to not just that relationship, but other relationships in the Middle East.
Finally, Ambassador, you have a most compelling biography. Born in Dublin, immigrant to the US, war correspondent, academic, human rights activist, professor, government official, cabinet member and ambassador. What is next for Samantha Power? Many have talked of you as possibly serving in a Joe Biden administration if he wins in November's election. But some have even said you could be the next Secretary of State.
What is next is doing everything in my power, whatever the limits of those powers are. I'm going to test those limits to get Joe Biden elected. I think I would be honored to serve again in some fashion. I think after this presidency, the Trump presidency, I feel all of us feel a duty, to do whatever we can, whether in our own communities or at a national level. So I'd be honored to serve. But my priority, again, is getting Joe Biden back into the White House.
Ambassador Samantha Power, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thanks, James.